Hello and welcome to World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, the UK was the victim of a terrorist attack on Monday. What's behind this attack, and how can Europe deal with the growing frequency of such attacks? Second episode of our series AI and You. We will speak with the godfather of Israel's high-tech industry to see how a country can develop and export innovation. We begin with the Manchester terrorist attack that killed 22 people and injured over 60 others. British investigators told French authorities that the suspect in the Manchester bombing had probably traveled to Syria. Meanwhile, the UK has raised its terrorist threat level to critical. It's the first time since 2007 that the UK threat levels have been raised, and suggests that another terrorist attack is possibly imminent.
In Manchester, thousands attended a vigil to pay their respects to the dead and injured, a tangible image of a community together in grief. Sentiments shared hundreds of miles away at a royal garden party where Queen Elizabeth called for a minute's silence in respect. The harsh reality, however, according to UK security chiefs, is that the UK's terrorist threat level must be pushed to critical.
This means that their assessment is not only that an attack remains highly likely, but that a further attack may be imminent. The change in the threat level means that there will be additional resources and support made available to the police as they work to keep us all safe. This means that armed police officers responsible for duties such as guarding key sites will be replaced by members of the armed forces.
Police raids across the Manchester region support the Prime Minister's belief that Salman Abedi, the Manchester-born suicide bomber, may be part of a wider terrorist network.
Part of this response has seen us arrest a 23-year-old man in connection with the attack, and we've also carried out 2 warrants.
The explosion from Abedi's improvised bomb ripped through crowds leaving the Manchester arena following a concert by Ariana Grande. Most very young fans of the YouTube star, targeting them an act of revulsion for leaders around the world.
It is inconceivable that someone uses a cheerful pop concert to kill so many young people and cause serious injuries to them. My deepest sympathies are with the victims and their families.
So many young, beautiful, innocent people living and enjoying their lives murdered by evil losers in life.
As this city comes to terms with the horror of the attack on the Manchester arena, it's also becoming apparent that with the raising of the terrorist threat levels, there is a longer-term impact on life in Britain.
So how should we understand the latest development of the investigation, and what are the painful lessons learned from Tuesday's Manchester arena blast? We turn to our panelists right now. In Beijing, joining us, Yan Shuai, an analyst at the Anti-Terrorism Center at the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. Welcome to our program. In London, we invited Mr. Nigel Inkster, who is the Director for Future Conflict and Cyber Security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and also former Assistant Chief of British Secret Service. Thank you for joining. I understand that for medical reasons you have to wear glasses, but I really appreciate it that you are still with us today. Thank you so much. Meanwhile, joining us in Paris, Mr. Timo Lohocki, who is a transatlantic fellow with the Europe program at the German Marshall Fund. Welcome as well. Gentlemen, I want to start with the latest development of the investigation. Mr. Inkster, this is not the first time that you and your colleagues are encountering with such a crisis. Help us understand. Some people on the run, while one blowed himself. What exactly do you think needs to be urgently done by the police and also the army right now in the UK?
Right. Well, in terms of the investigation, what we saw was one individual detonating a suicide bomb. What we don't know is whether this individual actually built the bomb or whether there is somebody else out there who is capable of building further such bombs, and whether there are further individuals who are prepared to act as suicide bombers. So understanding this, I think, is very important. I don't think it's possible, realistically, to learn to build a terrorist bomb from the internet. This is something that you've actually got to do for real. You've got to do it hands-on. And what this means is that somebody somewhere has been properly trained to do this. So that's the first point. As to the military, I think the main role of the military is twofold. Firstly, to provide protection for high-profile targets that need to be protected so that the police can be freed up for other things. Secondly, to serve as a readily deployable force in the event of a further terrorist incident, particularly a so-called marauding attack in which somebody takes a gun and starts shooting into a crowd. And thirdly, just for reassurance for the public.
I see. Those are very important information for now. Mr. Lohaki, of course, at this point, the level of alarm is critical, which means there could be an imminent threat of terrorism still inside the UK, but also it means a lot to the other European capitals as well. Mr. Lohaki.
Well, I do want to second the previous speaker. I do think the raising of security level so far is largely intended to free police forces in the UK to aid the investigation and to create a level, or say a feeling of assurance for the British public. So far, I would say that the impact in other European countries is rather limited, given that the terror level in other European countries remains unchanged, and so far the police, at least in the most important European states, haven't seen or couldn't investigate yet whether there is a link between these bombings and terror attacks and terror challenges in their countries, meaning that so far I do think the impact remains largely focused on the UK so far.
We want to go a little bit in history to take a look at what happened over the past 10 years or so in terms of the types of terrorist attacks and its impact and what were behind them. The Manchester Arena attack is the deadliest in the UK since the 2005 Central London bombing. On July the 7th, 2015, Islamic extremist suicide attackers set off bombs on 3 separate trains on the London Underground and 1 on a double-deck bucker, also leaving 56 people dead and 700 others injured. On March the 22nd this year, British man Khalid Massoud drove a car into the pedestrian on the Westminster Bridge before crashing into the Palace of Westminster, leaving 6 dead. 2 days ago, of course, the latest incident, but some have been suggesting there has been a way of change how these terrorist attacks are being done and what could be and who could be behind them. Mr. Inkster, do you see the patterns have changed and the reasons, even though we're still under investigation right now, for this one, have changed at all?
Yes, I think there's been a significant change. Since 2001, the prevailing model of jihadist terrorism was the Al-Qaeda model, which was, so to speak, top-down, centrally directed, carefully constructed plans that were carried out in particular countries, but always directed by controllers at what was effectively Al-Qaeda's headquarters. And the aim was always to try to achieve outcomes comparable in scope to the Twin Towers attack in 2001. The thing about this approach is that it requires a lot of connectivity. It gives intelligence agencies a lot of opportunities to get across and to disrupt this kind of attack. Plus, they're actually very difficult to do. What we're now seeing is a new variant of jihadism, which is more bottom-up. What the Al-Qaeda jihadist ideologist Abu Musab al-Siri wrote about in his Global Call to Islamic Resistance, which is basically groups of people working to a broad central directive, but with a lot of leeway to undertake activities with some degree of control, but with also a degree of autonomy. And the concern is more about achieving an outcome rather than necessarily trying to replicate the circumstances of the Twin Towers attack.
Mr. Yan, you are also an anti-terrorism expert. You see some pattern changes over the years. Previously, it was much more coordinated. It seemed there are many people behind one specific incident. And yet, you see more and more so-called lone wolf operation with terrorist groups eventually claim the responsibility, yet hard to verify. What do you make of this change at this point? Which is more dangerous to you?
Yeah, after the 9/11, we have seen quite a few significant large-scale terror attacks, especially in Western world. But this is mainly due to the increased counterterrorism measures taken by these countries. So the Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, like this kind of terror groups, they don't have much chances to carry out a large-scale attacks against them. But at the same time, they called for the lone wolf attacks. This kind of attacks with the increased skills and the availability of equipment such as rifles, guns, and explosives. Right. So they become more and more deadly compared with the past. But at the same time, what we should pay attention is that although Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State pay a lot of attention to call for the lone wolf attacks, they do not give up the plans to carry out large-scale attacks. Actually, currently ISIS has some organization in its organization. It's called ENMI, and it's has it's intelligence agency, secret unit in the ISIS organization, and it has a special unit responsible for planning significant and coordinated large-scale attacks against the West.
So that is extremely dangerous. Of course, that means much more coordination urgently needed among capitals inside Europe. Mr. Lohaki, of course, Europe has experienced so much over the past few years with new immigrants, the Syria crisis, many other things, terrorist attacks included. So do you think capitals are really prepared, even though they try to talk about their preparedness, particularly when it comes to coordination?
Well, it's a very difficult question to answer
right.
in a very brief sentiment. I think the most important thing is twofold. For one, the question is how can you prevent that these attackers, these possible threats, enter European soil, and here, especially given the migration situation, being not as controlled, not as thought through as it could have been in the last 2 or 3 years. Most certainly more coordination amongst European capitals is needed in order to forge a coherent European migration and counter-terrorist strategy. However, I do think what we've seen over the last years is that most or a significant share of the attacks carried out were carried out by individuals which have been living in the respective countries for a longer time already, meaning a coordinated or thought through migration strategy policy would have had a very limited impact on these attacks. So the question remains how intelligence sharing and security cooperation amongst capitals can ensure or can decrease the chances for further attacks on these matters. And this again depends on intelligence sharing and to what extent information sharing is indeed capable of tackling these matters. But I do think, as we just heard, these lone wolf attacks require a very limited degree of cooperation and a lesser degree of interaction amongst possible challengers or possible attackers.
Right.
So the question remains if intelligence sharing is even feasible or is even the proper tool in order to prevent these attacks.
It's a very good question, I guess. It's an ultimate question we really need to ask right now. I want to go back to you, Mr. Yingster, about those questions. Are we going to see crises one after another with bigger frequencies even than what we experienced over the past few years? and what we have, the tools in hand, to prevent at all or only to root out terror groups and terror lone wolves once incidents like these happen? Please be frank with us.
Yep. Okay, well, firstly, we have to recognize, and we've said this many times, that this is a generational problem. It's not going to be something that's solved in 3 or 4 years. We've got to recognize that most serious terrorist campaigns do tend to last a generation. I think this one will be no exception. Secondly, the character of terrorism is that terrorist incidents are episodic. You go for long periods without anything happening, and then all of a sudden you get a cluster of events.
That's right.
And this is why, you know, terrorist acts can be so destabilizing. Thirdly, I think, you know, this is a learning process. Intelligence agencies, police forces are learning all the time. But counterterrorism investigations are a bit like doing a jigsaw puzzle. In Chinese, 拼图游戏, against the clock, but without knowing when the clock runs down, not knowing what the end result is going to look like, and with the almost certainty that some of the pieces are missing. I mean, that is what a counterintelligence investigation feels like.
Right.
So inevitably, there's always going to be some improvisation, but we are getting better at this. But what we have is an action-reaction dynamic. As the intelligence agencies identify one set of techniques and get better at dealing with them, the terrorists adapt and go elsewhere.
That's right. Mr. Yan, of course, this time we see that IS claimed the responsibility. We have seen this as a critical moment. It was the time when U.S. President Donald Trump, you know, so-called the leader of the free world, visited the Middle East. It is also the time when the UK is trying to make a decision, so-called on the Brexit process. So what would this, in a way, reflect the realities of what we call the Western world and the choices that they have to make at this critical juncture? Mr. Yan.
This is the major background that the Islamic State has carried a series of attacks in the West. Actually, currently, the ISIS is facing a mounting military pressure from the international community, especially after the United States Trump administration taking into office. Trump voted to increase and accelerate its military campaign against the Islamic State, and we also see that in recent 2 days Trump visited Middle East countries, and there he met with more than 50 Islamic State of heads, and they agreed to establish a kind of military alliances and called for the Islamic countries to devote more than 30,000 military personnel to combat Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. So we are seeing that Islamic State may be defeated militarily by the end of the year. So, and this background, the Islamic States urgently need to carry out attacks to show its power, to show that it still strong and can stand up with the outsider military campaigns against it.
Certainly we see this is not only just attacks, but also propaganda wars between us, the civilized world, and the terrorists themselves. Mr. Lohaki, at this point, as Mr. Yan just illustrated for us, what can governments do? On the one hand, military clampdown of the IS is going on and probably likely to get ever more intense. And on the other hand, you see this group struggling, quote unquote, to survive and probably will counterattack even more. So how should we go through this critical moment? Mr. Lohaki.
I do think, as we just heard, it's very important to emphasize and reiterate that this very problem is not new and it won't vanish in the coming months or the coming years.
Yeah.
So aside from intelligence and military countermeasures, the most important task for Western governments is to prepare their societies, their electorates, their citizens, that this very situation is here to last. We just heard it might last an entire generation, it might last a few more years, it might last 2 more decades. It will most certainly not go away in the coming months and years. This means that the government needs to send a multifaceted message to their citizens. For the first, it is that the governments will do all they can to improve security matters, while at the same time trying to ensure civil liberties. For the second, though, they need to be very honest with their voters, with their citizens, and say, we will do all we can, but we will not be capable of preventing all terror attacks. On the contrary, it is very likely that we will see further attacks despite our efforts to counter them. And thirdly, they should emphasize the time frame we're talking about here. This very problem is going to be with us for various years to come, and they need to create, you might say, a sort of civilian resilience, as we currently see in Manchester, that people do not get intimidated by these attacks, but accept them being here for the foreseeable future, and not changing the way of life, because this is exactly what these terrorists are trying to aim for.
Right, but of course these attacks and counterattacks always work with the local politics as well. Before we go, we only have 45 seconds left. I do want to ask you, Mr. Yinster, as you've been working on the intelligence on terrorism for a long time, so how should we read the picture? Domestic politics vis-a-vis, all of these tragedies and yet terrorist attacks. How would that work? What advice?
Well, yeah. Well, one of the big risks, one of the aims of the jihadists is to create political and social strife in the countries where they're undertaking the attacks. They want to elicit populist, right-wing reactions, overreactions, so that they can then create a kind of self-fulfilling narrative. And it's therefore absolutely critical at times like this that politicians get together, put aside their differences, and start delivering some coherent and consistent messages.
And certainly we've been hearing that from different European capitals, also from President Trump of the US, and also from the Chinese President Xi Jinping as well. It seems that the support is coming from all over the world for the UK right now. Thank you so much, gentlemen, the three of you, for joining us at this critical moment. Yan Shuai, Miguel Inkster, and also Timo Hawking. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Still to come on our program. In the second episode of our series AI, Artificial Intelligence and You, we will speak with the godfather of Israel's high-tech industry to see how a country can develop and export innovation. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Israel, as we know, is well known for its technological innovation. In the second episode of our series of World Insight with Tian Wei, AI and You, Artificial Intelligence and You, I sat down with Yossi Vardi, an Israeli entrepreneur and investor. Born in the 1940s, he's regarded as the godfather of Israel's innovation industry. Vardi began his entrepreneurial career at the age of 26. One of his most famous investments was the first popular internet instant messaging service, ICQ. Over the past 47 years, he has founded and helped build 85 high-tech companies in various fields, among them software, energy, internet, mobile, electro-optics, and water technology, just to name a few. With the continuous development of high-tech industry in his country, what challenges would industry face, and will there be a tech bubble? We'll ask him. How big is the bubble?
I think it's big, but I don't have the crystal ball. So every time there is a bubble, there is an explanation that this time is different. You cannot have a bubble unless you can convince yourself that this time is different. And every time they explain why this time is different, is a different explanation. And then eventually, after so and so many years, it proved that it's not different.
So there is a bubble, a big one, and yet there is still opportunity.
There is opportunity. I think there are always opportunity in the small companies. The biggest opportunities are in the small companies, but people are psychologically hate risk. So this is why they're staying away. But I think that there are opportunities, there is opportunities, and there will always be opportunities as long as you evaluate the thing in a sober way, not just betting on big dreams.
What is the way to stay sober?
What is the way to stay sober? I wish I knew. You know, you have to be doubtful and you have to ask yourself what is really going on.
So 1968, your first startup, until now, so many different generations, technology, entrepreneurship, innovation policies. How did you survive and thrive?
The world went huge changes. Players have been changed, generation passed, but I think the one common thing which stay, or few common things which stay all the time is number one. It's not so much about the technology, it's about the spirit of the human being, the spirit of the person, about the curiosity, about the drive to be always in the cutting edge of technology, and while the themes are being changed, the driving force are always the same. So I guess this is what kept me still being able to continue to follow and to renew my interest.
Easier said than done. You love people who can do teamwork, but you yourself is a lone champion, shall I say that?
Yes and no. You know, I manage my thing myself, but I collaborate with many, many people. So the key is to know, on one hand, how to focus on your interests, but also how to ally with other people which can supplement the things that you don't possess yourself.
You invested originally, ICQ, back in the 90s. That was the very beginning of it.
Yeah, but it was more, from my side, it was more of a matter of luck than a matter of wisdom, because when these four kids who invented the internet-wide instant messaging came to me to seek for investment, I didn't understand what they are talking. Not I didn't understand, they didn't want to tell me what they're doing. They told me it's a secretive, and the only reason I gave them the money because my son was involved in it, and he came to me, and I couldn't refuse him. But they didn't. I asked them what it is. They said this is secretive. We cannot tell you, which give you indication how much I'm being trusted by my own siblings. And 4 months after they showed it to me, I said, this is really a ridiculous idea that people, instead of picking the phone, which is so simple, and talking about the phone, you have to do it by text. Eventually, it took me a few years to realize that maybe I was mistaken. You know, when we began to get every day 100,000 new users, not today, but I'm talking now 20 years ago, it was quite interesting, which shows you, by the way, that in this business of investing in new startups, the most important ingredient is luck.
You think?
Yeah, if you're sure, because it's all statistics. You cannot look on idea or something like this and say, I know that this will succeed. You know, I invested in 86 companies, 30 of them went bust, 30 of them failed.
Well, that's supposed to be that way, right? 1/3 of them.
Yeah, I don't know if it's 1/3 or half or 25%, but a big portion of them do not succeed. This is the nature of startups.
And how many succeeded?
I sold about 30 of them, and I still have like 25. And another observation is that the idea, I used to think that the idea is overrated. Today I know that the idea is not important. What is important is the execution. You can have the same idea, but if you execute it better, you will win. Look how WeChat is now taking over the world.
China now is experiencing the economic transformation and is vigorously promoting technical innovation. The history of Israeli high-tech development is a great reference to China. Early in its nationhood, Israel's most advanced industry was military technology. But in 1967, then French President Charles de Gaulle imposed sanctions on Israel's arms exports. The Jewish state then focused on civilian industries. Besides, Israeli innovation startups would be funded by the government. They could repurchase the government's shares after their success. Foreign investment has also helped. Now the tech industry has become a pillar of Israel's economy.
The genesis of the local technological development in Israel in the early 60s was mostly tied to defense. You know, we had defense challenges, we had to resolve them. Then the French have done embargo on Israel, and I always like to say that Charles de Gaulle was the father of the Israeli high-tech because he put the embargo.
He is smiling right now when you're saying it.
And I'm saying it with tongue-in-cheek. The second stage was to begin to do civilian products. As you said, money was not available. Then the government of Israel came with a very great program called Yozma, when they told financial institutions in Israel, if you will bring a VC from America, we, the government, will put 50% of the money, but we will let you buy us out if the project is successful. But then another thing happened, which is very, very important. Companies began to do exits. And when companies began to do exits, the entrepreneurs and the investors of the early stage, the first generation of these companies, got money, they began to invest in the second generation.
The thing is, what is the role, the proper role of government?
The proper role of government, I think, is number one, to see what is missing and to step into, like Israel, the government of Israel stepped into the first generation of VCs, but then pulled back. Yeah. And other thing, to encourage the players to go and take responsibility. I don't think that the government can infuse innovation top-down, but the government can encourage the grassroots to take responsibility, to create communities, to create these meetups and tools to get them aggregated and to connect the dots. The government should act as a catalyst to cause that ecosystem will be developed. But you cannot make the ecosystem by government employees. They have to identify the authentic leaders of the community in a certain place and empower them.
And what about now? I mean, today, Israel, you still don't have the cash because foreign investors still put in a lot of their money pumped into the Israeli innovation. Why is that?
First of all, there is cash available locally, but there is a lot of cash, a lot of investment money coming from abroad, and I think this is because of the unproportional size of the high-tech in Israel compared to the total economy. You have to remember that Israel is a small country. Yes. It's 8.5 million people, which is, 25% of Beijing, the whole population of the whole country, and yet the high-tech sector is so dominant and so big, and everybody has an idea, and every kid wants to create company and to create startup. Yeah. And this creates a need. But luckily, we have in Israel a phenomena that many international companies are coming to invest in Israel. Until 6-7 years ago, it was mainly the US companies. Then the European comes, and in the last 5 years, the Chinese are beginning to play a major role. And what these multinational companies are doing, like many household names like Microsoft and Google and Facebook and Amazon and AOL and
all have their research centers there.
Yeah, and as I said, in recent years, we see the number of Chinese players, and the number goes up and up, and we now have a few investments of Chinese investment banks and investment funds, etc. in Israel, and they are more than welcome.
China has been talking about indigenous innovation meaning innovation being born, nurtured here on this land. Is it possible?
I don't think it's not only possible, but I think it's happening. It's happening, and it's happening after the usual process that we see in everywhere where you have innovation. You know, you start in the beginning to do offshore work for other people. While doing the offshore work, you learned the processes, you created local community which know how to do it. Then few entrepreneurs emerged and said, okay, I can do it not for somebody who is sitting in overseas, I can do it for myself. And then the most important thing happened. You created role models, local role models, people like Jack Ma and Robin Lee and another 20, 30, 40 people which are inspiring a whole generation. And this is happening in China. So innovation is beginning to emerge. Now you have to enhance, you know, to put the fertilizer on this innovation process.
What is the fertilizer?
The fertilizer is building ecosystems, you know, breaking the silos. You have to work on it, you have to encourage it. The leaders, the community leaders, the leaders should show it, you know, they should get involved, they should visit the events, etc. They should inspire the people. We spoke earlier about the formats which are enhancing innovation. We see the flourishing of accelerators. Why accelerators are so good? Not because the mentor gives them an idea, but because you have 10 young people, 10 young companies sitting together and helping each other. Shared spaces, you know, like
but
hubs.
How to make that happen? I mean, of course, accelerator, we all understand, put them into the same space and they interact with one another. Maybe their business model complement one another, so it works. But for a country's policy, how can that be complementary?
I think the role of the country or of the city is to make sure that all the people who are involved in the startup community will meet each other, will trust each other, will support each other, will create meetings, will create hackathons, will create interaction.
But how would they trust each other? I mean, if you look at the competition in the Chinese market, you know very well, it's fierceful. You've been here several years already. You understand that. People tell you different stories. They're competitors. Yeah. So how could they work together? What would bring them together?
This is, I guess, a role of education and encouragement, the understanding that everybody benefits. Yeah, you should compete, you know, you should compete, but also you should support. The Americans, who are great in inventing words for everything, call it co-opetition. And co-opetition is the key. You compete, but also you collaborate and you cooperate. You have to understand the thing is like a watch with a lot of gears. All the gears have to be in place and all the gears have to turn each other. If you don't have this glue, it's like you take the watch, you put the gears on the table, each gear separately, and then you say, why it doesn't work? I am involved in doing some 40 events per year all over the world, where I invite young people and I put them together for 2 or 3 or 4 days. I do some of it with a company like WPP, some of it with other companies, some of it with friends of mine. You bring them together, you create trust, you create friendship, they feel more comfortable to work with each other, and then good things are happening.
Talking about Chinese innovation, adaptive innovation is the word always been used. But people also wonder, from adaptive innovation to disruptive innovation, how far is it going to be? Can one country just thrive upon adaptive innovation?
First of all, I want to tell you that you see more and more disruptive innovation beginning to come from China.
Give me examples. Latest you have seen?
Latest I've seen, I'm telling you, because my origins in the internet are from instant messaging.
Yes.
The whole world, I don't know if you know, the whole world is now worship WeChat.
Of course.
Everybody is trying to be inspired by WeChat and to see what is...
But that's an example of adaptive innovation.
No, this is not adaptive, this is disruptive. I will explain how payments are being done. You have all kinds of payment service, you have e-commerce services, etc. You know, these things are coming from here because people got the ambition, people got the confidence, but people got something which is much more important. I want to tell you what I see the major thing in China, which is going to change the shape of the high-tech industry in the world.
What is it?
For the last 7, 8, 10 years, hundreds of, maybe thousands of companies evolved in China which are catering to the local market. The local market is still not saturated. While they are catering to the local market, they are going this process that we said before. They learn how to produce, they learn how to develop, they learn how to manage teams, they learn how to do delivery, they learn how to do quality control. But in the process, they are improving the product and the processes. And once the local market will be saturated, they will begin to look for outside market. We are seeing it in China, and if you want to see what will happen, look on Alibaba and Huawei as two proxies of the ability of the Chinese companies to go abroad.
Yossi, what a pleasure.
Yeah, it's a
Thank
pleasure,
you so much.
and I'm looking forward to our conversation a year from now.
Absolutely.
By all means. Thank you.
Yossi Vardi, always smiling. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight with Tian Wei, CGTN, in your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight with Tian Wei team, thanks for watching, and tune in again tomorrow for more insights across China and around the world. Good night.